Welcome everybody to the first of our winter webinars for the Craft Skills for Garden Conservation project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. We've managed to get Erasmus funding for a total of 9 webinars on different topics to do with craft skills for gardeners, and then 9 practical workshops. So hopefully you'll have seen the website and see a lot more information about it there. So welcome to all our attendees from all over Europe, it seems, and our speakers from Norway, Sweden and the UK. I'm very pleased that everybody is speaking in English. It's a huge privilege for me as an English speaker to attend these webinars and be able to follow everything. So I will try and speak slowly because a lot of you, I know, English is not your first language. So my name's Kate Nicol. I was the head gardener on an 18th century estate in the UK that was owned by the National Trust. I then became a garden trainer for the National Trust for many years. So now I'm working as the workshop coordinator for this very exciting project, and we'll get started straight away. Here's the programme, and that's just the morning. It's a busy one, it's packed, and it's my job to try and keep everyone to time, including myself. As I mentioned, there'll be time for questions and answers, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address those in the breaks. And we'll also be asking questions of you. We've got a few polls and questionnaires because we want to find out information about you and your gardens and what you want to learn from these webinars. And it's also to introduce the topic. So I confess that as a horticulture student, soil science was something that you actually raced through to get to the interesting part, the plants. But how little did I know? And for hundreds of years, people have really been studying soil and how important it is as the basis of everything we do as gardeners. And here's John Claudius Loudon, who was a Victorian or 19th century garden writer. And this is just one of hundreds of illustrations he made of just tools for digging and tilling the soil. And then this is a quote from a Second World War broadcaster on the BBC, who fended off almost every question from the listeners with "the answer lies in the soil." So if that's the case, what is the question? So mankind has been tilling the soil for millennia. This is actually back in 2008, the beginning of my restoration project at Attingham Park. And we have the historic sources going back that far to actually tell us everything really that we want to know about why we have been turning over the soil. And on the website, you'll find we've been putting together a list of historical sources going right back to ancient Rome. Just a quick one, Virgil wrote a whole epic poem on the subject called the Georgics, and it literally means on working the earth. And he reveals how much the Romans actually knew about which plants suited which type of soil. But it's only in the last 100 years or so that we've started to understand just how precious a resource our soil is, just as we're beginning to lose so much of it, and how we should actually be doing our best to conserve it. So this is the wonderful lady Eve Balfour, who published The Living Soil at the height of the Second World War, when Dig for Victory in the UK was at its height, and also at the same time synthetic fertilizers were a major part of the war effort. But it's only more recently that concerns have been listened to, and in fact last December there was the launch of the European Union Soil Strategy, which is a key driver, and they want to have 2030 all those strategic interests well and truly applied to our soil. But what does all this mean for the hands-on gardener? So these are my volunteers at Attingham Park 15 years ago, following the plough literally and preparing the soil for planting. And they were following a great tradition of the annual turnover of the soil. which has been a traditional ritual in every walled garden, certainly. And here are the walled gardeners of Attingham Park back in the 1930s, jovially digging away. I suspect they weren't really digging, it was just for the photograph. They'd have been spearing each other's toes otherwise. But, and there we are in 2012, doing exactly the same. This is my team of, interestingly, all female gardeners. Finally, women were allowed to get their hands on the soil. And we carried on for years. We actually deployed some other creatures to do the job for us, to do our dirty work, some wonderful Tamworth pigs who turned over the soil and fertilized it at the same time. And we loved the results that we came up with. But we soon began to realize that whilst our methods were authentic to the period, so this is a Georgian garden, so hand digging was the ritual really and the routine, they were becoming unsustainable because the weed seeds continued to emerge year after year. So we started listening to one of our speakers this afternoon, Charles Dowding, and we've been experimenting with the no-dig method, which started in 2018 in just one section of the garden. And you'll be hearing later about how a lot of heritage gardens, certainly in the UK, are switching to this method. So another theme we'll be hearing about this morning is that of growing in protected areas and particularly in pots, which is where we as gardeners get to create exactly the right growing conditions for what we want for our plants. So it's how we mix the composts, the growing media, as we should say, to make that distinction clear, both in the past and right now. So those are the topics that we'll be covering. So we're going to begin with getting back to the basics of what the soil, the actual soil, can tell us about our gardens. And Karen Lindblad is, excuse my pronunciation of all these names, I'm sure to have it wrong, I'm afraid. She's an archaeologist based in Sweden. And most archaeologists, it seems to me, with my untrained eye, dig away the soil to find the treasures buried beneath. But Karen actually studies the soil itself to see what it can tell us about the history of our gardens. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully we'll get Karen's slideshow up and running. While we do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about her. For the last 20 years, she's worked on excavations in medieval sites as well as on restoration projects in historic parks. She's currently working on a project with her colleague, the archaeobotanist Jens Heimdall, which is financed by the EU and the Swedish Board of Agriculture. And it has the most fantastic title in English, which is Bog Myrtle Ale, Parsley and Parsnip. Green food culture from the Viking Age to industrialization. So Karen, welcome to Craft Skills for Garden Conservation, and please tell us all about your work.
Thank you very much. I can start now.
Go ahead.
So my name, as Kate told you, is Karin Lindblad, and I'm working in Sweden, mainly in the central parts of Sweden, and I'm working with the excavations in historical gardens from the Viking Age to the 1850s, about 1850s. And the Viking Age starts at 850, so it's about it's a long period, it's about 1,000 years. And today I'm going to talk very briefly, of course, about garden soil, but first a very short introduction to garden archaeology. Change. In Sweden, there are mainly two fields of garden archaeology. We work in parks, by castles and manors, and then we deliver information, historical information about the gardens before the gardens will be restored or reconstructed. And these gardens are still, and parks are still visible and often in use. And then we have the contract archaeology, when someone is going to build a new house in a town, or whether it's a parking place, you have to do an excavation ahead of that. And these gardens are, of course, not visible in the landscape today. And I will talk mainly about these types of garden soils today. Next, please. At Garden Archaeological Excavations, we of course use archaeological methods, but we also use other kind of analysis and source materials. And here you can see some of them. You can see ground penetration radar, where we can identify features underneath today's surface. For example, pathways, wells, etc., under the ground. And it's sometimes a very useful method. We work together with archaeobotanists who study in microscope the garden soils, the contents of the garden soils, and I will get back to that. We use historical maps, and to the right, down to the right, you see a historical garden from the town of Norrköping in Sweden in the 1800s. And they might be very useful, especially when the garden is not visible today. And sometimes we also, that's me, sending apples to experts to see what kind of apple trees that are still growing in the garden. Okay, next picture, please. And this is a historical map, just as an example how you can work with them. The surveyor, this is a map from 1696 of the Swedish town of Linköping. And the surveyors, they have written down which part of the town is used for orchard, is the yellow one. Next to the cathedral of Linköping, you have a very large one, for example. And that we have marked green is the kitchen gardens, and the fields in the town, they are light green. As you can see, Linköping at the end of the 1600s was a very green town, and that's quite new results in Swedish archaeology. And you can see at the top, I have written excavation area, and we'll have a look at two town yards from the 1600s, a reconstruction of them. Next picture, please. This is, you can say, a typical medieval and early modern town yards in Sweden. In the middle of the plot, there is it's the dwelling house, and in front you have the main road, and you have economy buildings ahead of the dwelling buildings. And the gardens in the town yards, they're always at the very back of the town plot. And they might be as much as 1/3 of the town plot that the people living in the towns, I forgot the word, used their plots for kitchen gardens. And they are always the enclosed areas, as you can see, with wooden fences. You have cultivation beds that we sometimes can study archaeological, and almost all the town plots had their own well for cooking and so on, but of course also for the gardening. Next picture, please. And this is what it looks like at an archaeological site. You see a well to the left. You see wooden bins to the top right, and Maria Flink will talk about later about them. It's like they're used for compost in the gardens, and they're always placed at the very back in the garden. And to the bottom right, you see a fallen fence from the Middle Ages in the town of Linköping. That's how the gardens were enclosed in the Middle Ages and early modern times. Next one, please. And this is a section through garden soil in the town of Norrköping in Sweden. It's not special for this town. It always looks like this. At the bottom, you can see the yellow natural sand. And then you see about the garden soil. It's about 30 centimeters in thickness. And very special for the kitchen gardens in the towns is that you have used a spade blade to work in the garden. And I don't know if you can see it, but at the interface between the garden soil and the yellow sand, you can see marks from a spade blade digging into the yellow sand. Next picture, please. And here is another section through a garden that was not visible at all in Stockholm before we excavated it 2020. In this section, you can see the clay. It's the natural soil in the bottom. And at the upper part, you can see the remains of a stone building. And between the clay and the stone building, in the left parts, you see the garden soils, and it's about 70 centimeters thick and quite homogeneous, as they always are, because you have been digging for centuries through them. And to the right, on top and to the left of the stick, red and white stick, you can see walkways that are made out of gravel in several layers. They had changed from yellow sand to thicker gravel. That's something we study as well. This is a garden from the 1600s to the about 1800s. Next picture, please. And this is out in the countryside. It's a vicar's garden outside the town of Norrköping in Sweden. And you see my colleague Alf, he's standing on the natural soil. And behind him, you can see a section of the garden soils. And as you understand the length of Alf, you can see it's about 1 meter thick garden soils. And this is how we excavate them to get, there is no stratigraphy, often no stratigraphy in them. So we have to use, to date the garden soils, we have to use the artifacts that we find in the garden soil. Next picture, please. And this is what Alf found in this garden soil. It's an example what you can find. It's waste from the kitchen, and you could call it compost, but it's not compost in that way that we see it now, really, because you see it's potsherds, it's planting pots, it's clay pipes and coins. So the artifacts that we find in the garden soil, they can tell us about the household who used the garden, when the garden was in use, and sometimes also about what kind of tools you have used in the garden. And you can see it's rubbish from the household, potsherds, for example, but also things that people have lost, the gardeners and the people working in the garden, they have lost in the garden, like the coins you see there. It's one is from 1740. And the clay pipes, it's of course from the people working in the gardens as well. And there is also small pieces of planting pots, but you can see it better in the next picture. These are planting pots found in garden soils, and in Sweden they are used from about the 1600s and onwards. And the older ones, they are made by hand, but they look a lot like the planting pots today, and you can find really, really tiny ones up to the size of, in diameter, about 20 centimeters or something like that. And we mainly find them in larger gardens, like where they have had greenhouses and things like that. Not that much in the towns. Next picture, please. I have to hurry up, I see. And these are example on medieval a medieval rake and a medieval spade blade in iron, found in a garden in the medieval town of Vadstena, probably used by the gardeners in the 1400s. Next picture, please. And here in the picture, you can see cultivation, the darker structures in the light sand, they are cultivation beds, as you can see in the medieval wooden carving as well. They are often about 1.2 meters. It's the 2 alna, it's the old Swedish measurement. And they are perfect to work in from 2 sides. And these planting beds, they are from the medieval times, about the 1400s. Next picture. You can see the spade blades to the left, and in the fields they used ard. You can see it in the picture to the right at the bottom, the marks of the ard. Next picture, please. And sometimes it happens that we can see the seeds in the garden soil. You see peach, and at the bottom it's elder seeds. And quite often it starts to grow as well after our excavations, the year afterwards. And the picture to the right is an example of that from the garden in Stockholm I was talking about, and it's a thorn apple, but we had other plants as well. Next picture. And this is a picture of my colleague Jens Heimdal, who is an botanist. We take samples from the soils, and he helps us to identify the seeds in the gardens. And here you have thorn apple at the top and a chickpea at the bottom. Next picture. But he doesn't only identify seeds in the garden soils. This is examples on what you can find as well. You can see how the people have, what kind of fertilization were used, what kind of compost. You can see signs of irrigation. so there is a lot of information about the gardens and the gardeners in the garden soils that it's not visible until you look at it in microscope. Next picture, please. And these are examples of seeds from medieval kitchen gardens and orchards in Swedish towns. You see vegetables, it's kale at the top, kale, parsnip, and beetroot. And herbs like oregano, coriander, and lavender. For example, coriander has been in use from the Viking Age and onwards. Maybe people think most people think it's a new herb. And then you see medical plant, it's motherworth, and example of trees is pear. Next picture, please. Our excavations and results from the garden archaeological excavation the last 20 years has changed the traditional picture of the horticultural progress in Sweden in many ways. This is the old picture, and you can still read it in books, that it's the monastery and the convents that brought the horticulture to Sweden. You take the next picture, but this is no longer true. It's a much more complicated pictures. And with new excavations and new results, this picture would probably deepen and get even more complex. And that's all. I have one more picture. And here are some works, if you're interested in garden history and garden archaeology. They are in Swedish, but I can recommend this book to the left. It's quite new. It's Swedish garden history. And to the right, there is another book. I can't translate it right now. It's about gardening as well. And if you're interested in our excavations, you can follow us on our website, www.archaeological.com, or on Instagram, Archaeological. You can follow our excavations and our results and get our reports and the new project that I'm working with. Thank you. Next picture. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. That was fantastic. So while Johan, who's our next speaker, gets his presentation ready, let me just tell you a little bit about him. So he's a Swedish gardener and a conservation biologist, and he's managing a bit of living archaeology, the hamlet of Askhult, which is on the west coast of Sweden, south of Gothenburg. And so he's involved in restoring and recreating the cultivated cultural landscape back to before 1825. I think it's from 1600 to, he'll tell us all about it. Anyway, so he's going to tell us all about the conditions and the difficulties and successes and setbacks with soil restoration. So Johan, if you unmute yourself and share your screen, I hope we'll see your wonderful slides. Here we go. Now we're not seeing the full screen at the moment. There we go. Good, perfect.
Yep. Are you seeing the full screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. It's so fun to be here and talk. So yeah, my name is Johan Gustafsson, and I'm the gardener at the hamlet of Askhult, which is managed by Västkuststiftelsen, where I also work as a conservation biologist. And I've been working there since spring 2020, so quite new. So this is my third season at the hamlet of Askhult. and so yeah, we'll be speaking about the soil restorations, but it's hard to only talk about the soil. It's like the restorations in whole, because everything in Eskult is connected to the landscape and the surroundings. So it will be a little bit about everything. So here on the picture you see the hamlet, and the houses in the hamlet today are built during the from the 17th to the 19th century, and the houses aren't like rebuilt; they're just repaired in place. So really old houses, and yeah, it consists of 4 individual farms, but only one farmland. So quite intensive agriculture with 4 farmers in one farmland, and plenty of people when everybody was living in the hamlet. So yeah, it's located on the west coast of Sweden, close to Gothenburg, 45 minutes from Gothenburg, in the county of Halland, north parts of Halland. And it became a nature reserve in 97, and then turned into a cultural reserve in 2004. So when I planned this, I talked to like the expert of geology on Eskult, and he said that how fun, the soil is the whole reason why the hamlet is built where it is. So he told me that I need to speak about like the geology of the place. So the hamlet is built upon a hill, or he told me like a giant bread loaf in the landscape, a giant moraine bread loaf. So it's a quite like rough surroundings and flat lowlands, which were like really wet in history. So but then up on this hill, it's more dry and flat fields. So easier to cultivate back in time. And yeah, this bread loaf is called a drumlin in Swedish. I don't know the English word for it, but it was created by the inland ice, and you can see like in the surroundings there plenty of those creations and old hamlets on each of them. So and here we see a bit more about the surroundings, which are really stony and rough. So you can see why they were cultivating up on this hill. And as I wrote here, when people come here, many people come here to visit, they see those unpainted houses and really weather exposed place, and think it must have been a really harsh and poor place to live, but the place has been like cultivated for over 5,000 years. So people have been living here and cultivating the soil for a really long time. So back in time, it was like when now the flatlands are like dried out and we've made ditches and such. But in history, it was like the best place you could stay in this part of Sweden. And yeah, so the soil is really, yeah, the moraine soil is contains of all those different fractions, from like big boulders to and stones, and in this part of Sweden it's quite sandy, but here we made some soil samples and saw that it was up to 10% clay in the soil as well. So and that's not really not so much in the surroundings. So that made like the soil more, it can hold moisture more, so, and easy to work with the sandy mix. So a good natural soil in the place. And yeah, during the 20th century, the surroundings or the fields were modernly driven. The last person who lived in the village, he lived there alone. His name was Gottfried. He died in 64. So quite recently, people lived here. But he didn't cultivate the fields and the fields himself. He leased it to a farmer nearby, and yeah, he was he drove it like modernly or rationally. So all the like agricultural history, the place were changed. So the cultivated small patches were merged to bigger patches, and all the boulders and cairns were removed from the fields. So it looked like more like a modern agriculture. But then Eskil became a nature reserve and culture reserve, and then our restoration goals was to show how the agricultural landscape looked like in southwest Sweden before all those agricultural reforms took place during the 19th century. So we had like the starting point to find all of these old documents and maps. So here you see a map from 1825, and it's like the first map material we got from Eskil. So this was what we wanted to recreate. And so all the boulders and cairns were brought back into the field. So all the hard works to take them away, it was a lot of hard work to bring them back into the fields again. And then and all the small patches were recreated as well, and like the areas between the patches with the small areas with bushes and small trees were recreated. So you see on the lower picture here one of the recreated fields, and then we had to start to try to get back to like the normal balance of the soil again, because it has been like boosted with fertilizers and yeah, as in a modern agriculture. So and we also saw that the pH was really low from all the acid rain. So we had a lot of work to do with trying to get back to like a natural balance of the soil. And then in the 1999 or something, the farmers who still work there today, my colleagues, started to work with their horses and old agricultural implements. And so yeah, they had like this big Brabant horses, which is like a Belgian horse, I think, which is not historical correct, but still there's a lot of really heavy work for the animals. So we had to use like really big horses. And yeah, they started to work with the soil with all of these old agricultural implements and start to cultivate like the old sorts of cereals and yeah, with cultural heritage, and because of the like fertilized soil, they had to like impoverish it again. So they just harvested what they were growing and didn't really give anything back to the soil to make the soil poorer again, or get back to that balance. And so what was the results of that? We at first we had a massive invasion of thistles. So all of these sleeping seeds that were outcompeted by fertilized modern cereals. They started to grow. So at first we had to handle that with grazing animals mostly. And then we also saw many endangered arable weeds starting to grow again without competition from the modern cereals. So we had a much bigger biodiversity in the fields again, and that was a good part of it. And then of course we had smaller harvests, but that was a part of the goal, because the cultural heritage cereals give lesser harvest, and the soils were poorer. And today we still in some parts have quite much weed invasion, because in some parts the soil is still really the pH is really low, so we had to put out chalk to try to find that balance again. And as Thomas, the farmer, said, he has been working there for 30 years now, and he's still struggling to find the right methods and the right balance in the soil. And he told me that as a farmer, you say it takes a lifetime to get to know the soil in one particular place. So. And then 6 years ago, they started to recreate the bigger designs of the gardens and find where they cultivated the soil for vegetables. And so they started to rebuild those old stone walls and turn the soil again, because it has been turned to pasture land or meadowland, or I don't know what you call it, but with grazing animals on. But when you started to dig the soil, you could see exactly as we spoke of in the earlier, that you can see exactly where it was cultivated historically. Yeah, we then that garden project started, and we wanted to show all the different components in a historic, I don't know what you call it in English, but we call it a cabbage garden historically, because they were growing a lot of cabbage, I think. But so this is what Bengt's garden looks like today, and this has been cultivated for some more years than the other ones, so it's much better soil here already. So the one in the background is just us, and we have had some problems when we recreated that, because they used machines that took up the mineral soil as well, so it's we have to feed it with more organic matter to get a better soil building. And it's really interesting that you see the the fields that they were growing historically that were the most productive aren't necessarily the most productive fields today. So it has to do with where they took the water from, where the wells were built, and how we're working with it today. So it has changed a lot. And this is during the early summer, and yeah, when I cultivate the soil here, I only use like ecological methods and seeds, and try to find all those different vegetables with cultural heritage that is like connected to the local place. And it's really hard to know to find the right vegetables and to know what the people on the countryside were growing back then. Many of like information about it is from castle environments or like church and such. Yeah, and I try to use as much rainwater as I can, or water from the lake. We haven't recreated the well yet, which is close by, but so now I collect rainwater, and yeah, I like to think of it as like the optimal place for practicing permaculture. I've read some permaculture during my education, and this is a really good place to practice it, to try to find, like, not put anything into the place that weren't there from the beginning, and try to work like creatively with the surroundings and what I already have. And so this is some of my harvests, and it's not always necessarily like the biggest harvest or the nicest harvest, but that's not the goal either. I like to keep it quite, or it shouldn't look too like rich or too clean in the gardens. I leave some weeds to, because yeah, now I work with this for full time, but back then they were more people, but they had a lot of work to do. So yeah, and I often think that they knew the soil so much better than I did, because they like cultivated it for their whole life, and their ancestors gave them the information about the soil. So I have some work to do. I've been there 2 years and many to go, hopefully. So and how do we manage the soil today? Yeah, I use no machines, just like historical garden tools, and I use no pesticides and fertilizers, or natural like cow dung and horse dung, and unfortunately no compost at the moment. We talk a lot about compost in the hamlet, and how they were doing with the compost, and yeah, we think most of like the grass and the weeds, they fed to their animals. So we use a lot of like horse dung and cow dung, so that's my main yeah, my main soil improvement, and I use it a lot during the springtime, and dig it down into the soil during the season. But we still have a lot of grass and weeds that we some of it I cover the soil with during the winter time to get a better like microclimate during winter time. But yeah, that's maybe not historically correct either. And so the goal isn't always to do like exactly as they did. back then, but to try to give ourselves like the same conditions that they had, and try to work if we have the same conditions and don't like use machines, use the tools they did, and try to find the ways that they work with the soil and with the landscape, then we hopefully will create like the most true picture of how the hamlet and the soil and the surroundings look like. And so the last picture, I'm thinking a lot of what I'm learning every day when I work at Eskult. And it's so important for me, or I'm learning a lot, that how important it is to know the history of the place. And I really want to like push on that. It's not only about like the cultural history, but the natural history as well. How like the soil is affected by the weather and on that particular place, and how hard it is to get like I mean, I read a lot about soils and historical gardening, but still it's so hard when you work with a particular place. It's always different from what you read. We talk a lot about to document everything that we're doing. So now that people aren't living in the hamlet anymore, and can't like put the information through generations, we have to be really, it's so important to document what we're doing. And so I don't know if I've translated it right, but the farmer, he also said that the history is written in the soil, and its letters are hard labor, care, and continuity. And I think it was a really nice thing to think about. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful, Johan. Thank you so much. It would be great to see that garden in reality and see how you're getting on. And what we mustn't forget, us, well, people in the UK, how short your growing season is, because I hear that really the soil is really too cold to work at all until about April. Is that true?
What I didn't.
The soil is still frozen.
Yeah.
And so you have a very short growing season, whereas we in the UK can garden throughout the year now.
Yeah.
So, that's fascinating. So we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and there's quite a few building up in the question and answer box at the bottom. We'll have a break shortly. We'll be back at 10:30 for questions. But before that, I'm hoping that Rebecca will be able to share her screen or send us somehow a link to a poll. We're going to ask you some questions. We want to find out where you're from, and it's a bit of an icebreaker as well, so that we'll be able to see where everyone's from and what they do. And then we're also going to have some questions about how you deal with the soil in your gardens. So we'll get that up and running. I think it's a link in the chat. Is that right? Yes, there it is. So if everyone can see in the chat box that Rebecca has put up a link, and then you can tick where you're from. Brilliant. I don't think we can as panelists. That's a great shame. But never mind, I do love this thing. And then you get a word cloud of where everyone's from. And then we're going to ask you about your profession as well. So, and then think about the questions you want to ask. And we'll have the two speakers still here who will answer those questions. I think, gosh, we've got Norway definitely in the lead at the moment, as far as I can see. Germany, Sweden, gosh, a huge international range of people. That's wonderful. So yeah, enjoy your coffee or tea or whatever it is you want, and we'll come back at 10:30. Anastine, I think, is going to put the poll up as well for us all. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.
Hur länge skulle vi ha rast?
Vi har pause fram till, ska vi se, 40 minuter.
40 minuter, okej.
40 minuter. Jag ska snart lägga ut den pollen.
Ja,
Nej, nu ska jag lägga den ut.
40 minuter, okej. Då går jag och äter nu tror jag. Ja.
So everybody had a coffee and walked about, rested their eyes from these screens. I've even seen the sun is shining out there. So Rebecca, I was hoping you could share the results of our little icebreaker, which is quite fun. Aha. Okay. So we had 74 people replying to the icebreaker, which is more than half of you, which is great because we've got 140 people. I think you can still add your location, and it looks like, I would say, Sweden is probably in the lead if we're going to be competitive about this. Oh, we're now 75, somebody else has added one, but of course it does depend on whether you've put Sweden or another part, another name for your Isle of Wight or whatever it is. So it's not exactly scientific, but quite fun. And then the interesting one, of course, will be what we all call ourselves, which is a debate in itself. And I'm so pleased to see that the vast majority are gardeners. There was a big move for a while in the UK to call ourselves horticulturalists. And a few people have, but I quite like the good old gardener term. So we have head gardeners as well, and tutors, teachers, volunteers, which is great, arborists, archaeologists, of course, apprentices. So a huge range there. That's great. Okay, so now Anastine, I'm hoping, has got some answers to some of the questions that we asked you as well. So this was just a little experiment to find out just a few questions we had. So our panel, hopefully, which is Karin and Johan, might have some comments to make. So interestingly, more than half their sites hadn't had any archaeological investigations. That's interesting, isn't it? So, but a third did. How about the next question? Which I forget what even that was. Did we even have a second question? Perhaps we didn't. So it's obviously still quite not rare in that more than, so 30% have had archaeological investigations, but a lot more didn't. So I think if we could talk to our panel, and we'll ask some of these questions that have come up. The first one came from Francisca Jonsson, and it was for Karin, and she wanted to know how old are the seeds that started to grow after the excavation? Is there any way of knowing exactly how old they were? So Karin, if you could unmute yourself, then we could.
It's of course hard to tell how old they are, but we made before the excavation, we had a botanist looking at all the plants, so it wasn't only Spikklubbor, I don't remember the name in English. There were other plants as well, but this one I showed on the picture. We also found it in the garden, in the old garden soils. So it might be from the 1600s, but it's hard to be exactly sure now.
Okay, and this isn't in my ignorance. Is it possible to carbon date seeds? Could you have done that?
Yes, we can do that. But when you are at these periods, the carbon dating, they are so wide.
I see.
You get like 200 years of,
Of course, that's not much help.
But but if you work with earlier seeds, you can use from the Roman Iron Age. It really doesn't matter if it's 200 years back and forth.
Yes, And of course, we all know that as gardeners, that some seeds will lay dormant in the soil for a very long time.
Very long time, yes.
Others disappear. So
No.
that's another part.
And these are usual. These often grows at archaeological sites.
Interesting.
Yes.
And I was fascinated at the range of what would appear to me to be quite exotic plants, as you said,
Yes.
coriander. I think of that as, you know, coming from the Near East at least.
But it has been used and grown in Scandinavia since the Viking Age.
Viking Age, fascinating.
So it's about 1,000 years, but then it has been forgotten in some way.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So there was another question from Joachim Sieler for you, Karen. I'm just going through as they are written on the list. So he says, if there has been a shift from objects to soil within garden archaeology, are the regulations following this shift? In other words, are the only the objects within the soil that are protected, not the soil itself? And how can you protect a valuable historical soil? So quite a philosophical question there from you.
Yes. The soils that are not in use anymore, they are protected. If they are older than, in Sweden, if they're older than 1850 and no longer in use, then they are protected.
Interesting. So you can't just throw them away; they have to be preserved somehow.
Yes, they have to be excavated if you're building something
right
on the spot. But if they are still in use, like in historic parks, they are not protected in that way, because then they are still in use.
Of course, yes.
Like
I don't know what the regulations are in other countries. That would be quite interesting to find out from people.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would be.
Yeah.
Because then they are considered as cultural layers and no longer in use.
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. And another one for Karen. And if the Romans actually never got to Scandinavia, if the Roman Empire didn't extend to Scandinavia, how and in what ways did Roman gardening come to Sweden? From your little map, Roman gardening was an influence.
It's not only Roman gardening, it's a Roman way of building roads, artifacts. They came to Sweden, even if the Romans never got here. They got to northern Germany and so on, but we still have influences in Sweden and Norway as well from the Roman. And there is a dissertation, I think it's in Swedish, Mikael something, and he can see that there are two big waves of new introductions of plants in Sweden. It's the Roman Iron Age and it's the Viking Age. And then it's obviously the medieval period as well. So how they got here, with people, bringing them, yes.
So it's perhaps the other way around.
Yes.
The Scandinavians going.
Yeah, and what the Romans called the German, they could also work in the Roman armies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a big influence.
And do you have any comments about that question in the poll about how relatively few gardens are investigated by archaeologists? Do you feel that is a mistake and that more people should be?
No. Lately, there are more and more. At least, then I speak for Sweden. I can't say for other countries. But in Sweden, it's the knowledge how to look at these soils. You have to have special methods. And for about 30 years ago, no one really realized what it was. Archaeologists were looking for streets, remains of streets, houses, and so on. Yeah. But now we have another way at looking at the soil as a information, archaeological source of information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So Johan, we had some good comments.
Yeah.
There's one here which is thanking you for your presentation and your interesting work. Besides the excavation and preservation of social, horticultural and cultural history, what do you think we're learning from those methods?
Hard to answer, but yeah, I mean, there's so much to learn from historical garden and historical ways to work. Me as a biologist as well, I like to think that we're learning so much, like to how to work with nature without like or connect to the nature again and to the soil and yeah, I mean, we need to learn how to manage and work with the whole earth without like what do you say, yeah, using it up. We need to like learn again how to manage it in sustainable ways. So a lot about sustainability and how to work with soil in sustainable ways. And if you look at the long history, then that is like the facts of how we should work with the soil in sustainable ways. So
definitely. I think that's what the whole day is about today, is how we can both be authentic and be as sustainable as possible.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the questions that's coming up, we can probably answer in some of the later talks, is there any evidence of covering or mulching in historical kitchen gardens? And is there historical examples of keeping a compost heap in the kitchen garden? And I think Marit and Maria are going to talk about that possibly later. But you, Johan, said that they didn't compost because they fed everything to the animals and used the animals as composting machines, really.
Yeah, as far as we know, in the countryside, but that may be shifting from location to location. But
yeah. But Karin, you did uncover some what looked like compost heaps in the gardens in the city. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Karin.
Yes, it's quite a common feature in the kitchen gardens in the towns. But we haven't excavated as many kitchen gardens in the countryside yet. So I really don't know about the countryside. And it's not, what we find in them are not really what we would call compost.
No.
But they used it in the garden soils. They put it in the garden soil.
Interesting.
Yes, it's
distinction is in the town you don't have the animals necessarily right there to
not that many
things for you, whereas in the countryside in your hamlet you do. So we've had a comment in the chat here, says that archaeological excavations are very expensive, so ordinary private gardens don't have those funds to do it, and what should we do about that problem? I mean, I suppose we can't engage archaeologists everywhere, but can we do it ourselves when we're digging or whatever we're doing? Are there things we should be putting in place in our own gardens so we don't lose that evidence?
It's not that expensive. It depends what you mean by expensive.
Yeah. I'm sure you're very expensive.
I also work in those kind of gardens where you don't have to do it. I've been working in Stockholm at Royal Djurgården, for example, in different parks there, and then they pay me for doing the excavation. They don't have to.
Right.
It's no, because it's still in use. But I think the evidence that we can get, it's valuable.
Absolutely.
For their restoration and for the historical knowledge of the parks.
Yes. Well, I remember certainly finding a lot of what was discovered incredibly useful in my project. Things like plant labels, you know, so that you had evidence of what trees were growing on the walls.
Yes.
Was great. And then even finding the location of lost buildings. You know, we had glass
Yes.
houses in the orchard that had been planted over, and to be able to find those was fascinating. Okay, so yes, public funds to pay for such excavations.
Yeah.
It says in the chat. Okay, so I think we've covered all the questions that have come through in the Q&A, and we still have a little bit of time before the next talk. So I'm just wondering whether we can have a bit more discussion between the two of you, Johan and Karin, about the differences between living archaeology, where you're actually growing and living in a place, and that what you shouldn't call it dead, I know, but something that has finished being used in that way. Johan, how do you feel about working in what is essentially an archaeological site?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and I haven't been into archaeology myself that much, so it's really much to learn just to work in that place. And yeah, I mean, we find new things every day, and discuss a lot about it in the hamlet and with people that's connected to Eskult. So yeah.
And Karin, are you concerned in some places that because these places are still being used, that we are actually destroying the evidence in our everyday work?
Sometimes. Yeah. Because in places that are still in use, they are very often very well preserved, and it's just a few centimeters below the surface you can find older garden features. But I do understand that are they in use? They are in use, but you have to be careful, because it's when using the garden, you are also destroying in a way. Yeah.
And I mean, we haven't recreated all the historic gardens in Eskult, so there's plenty of more places in the hamlet and around the hamlet which is still not used. So yeah, we're trying to be really careful with how we work.
And I can comment on one. We had at one excavation here in Linköping, we had a gardener working with us when we were excavating the garden soil, and that was really interesting to have a gardener's comment on what the compost, why did the people put these things in the garden soils? Different things like nails, iron nails, why?
Yeah.
For example, and that was really interesting.
Yeah.
To have a gardener's perspective on the historic garden soils.
Yeah.
Because it was valuable.
UK, we have a very strict rule. If your property is called a scheduled ancient monument, which quite a few people, I think possibly this afternoon, will be hearing about one, you can't dig or plant anything below a certain depth because of the danger. So that's quite restrictive. If you want to put in supports for your fruit trees, say, you can't put a post in the ground.
Okay.
So that is, you know, quite strictly regulated, but only for those scheduled ancient monuments. Okay. Yeah, as Joachim says in the chat, I suppose no dig gardening or no till gardening is a good way not to destroy archaeological soil. But you're covering it up every year with a new layer, aren't you? So there's a question here from Jerry Donovan. How is Eskult funded, and is its future secure as a living history site?
Yeah, it's funded by I don't know what's it called in English, but it's like the I don't know the English words for.
No, don't worry. But it's publicly funded, is it?
Yeah, publicly funded and from like EU projects and money for like culture from the state.
Right. So you don't have to be self-sufficient with visitors paying an entrance and buying cups of coffee and things like that.
No, not for like the cultural work and such, but do you say the commune, or the Kungsbacka commune? I don't know.
I think
we have like a coffee house as well, and an entrance, but that's for like guidings and the guiding tours and such. So
yeah, municipality is the English.
Okay.
Apparently. Thank you so much for helping with these words. We were going to talk at the end actually about all these different words that are sometimes specific to horticulture and are different in each language, and we're going to try and create a glossary of these terms. So anything that you come across that you think is useful to let us know about, a word that you use in your language that we need to translate, please send it in. Okay, so I think we might actually get cracking with the next one. It gives us a bit more time. I won't have to hustle people quite so much. So I think our next speaker is Marit, who is actually a Norwegian gardener based at Vea College, who are hosting this whole event for us today. And she's going to talk about the discoveries she made in Norwegian garden literature, talking about how the soil was cultivated in the past, and also how they mixed their own compost and soil for growing plants in pots as well. So Marit, could you try sharing your screen, and let's hope it works. I'm sure it will.
Thank you, Kate. I hope so. What do you see now?
We see the whole presentation with the small pictures on there. Perfect. There we go.
Yes.
We're there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. What I'm going to do now is to share with you the findings I have made after researching several historical Norwegian sources to find information on soil, cultivation, and composting. And I start with what is called double digging. Yes, double digging of soil has been known and carried out in Norway at least since the end of the 17th century. And double digging means working with the soil in depth. It is time-consuming, heavy manual work. According to several sources, was double digging quite common and was considered necessary to improve the soil when a new garden was to be established. The oldest source I have examined, Horticultura from 1694, describes double digging in a great detail. And I have included the description here as it largely corresponds to information in later sources. So here it is. Shall we see? Christian Gartner, the author of Horticultura, he says this about double digging, and hopefully the figure will help you to understand. Anyway, the procedure is as follows. The area to be prepared for garden must be dug deep with tools such as an iron spade, iron hoe, and iron pole. And you start from the edge and dig a trench, 62 to 78 centimeters deep and about 62 centimeters wide. And of course, centimeters was not used 300 years ago. Then they used Alen. As you can see, I have written it here. I couldn't translate it, so I have written the Norwegian word. But Alen, just a minute, is an old unit of measurement. previously used all over Europe, according to the encyclopedia. The length of aln has varied throughout history, and in Norway, the length was 62-75 centimeters when it went out of use. And this was in the 1870s, when the metric system was introduced in Norway. But craftsmen used aln as a measure of length long after this. I thought this was quite interesting about aln, so I have to take it with me here. Back to Christian Gartner and his double digging. It says that stones and roots are removed, and the trench is filled with livestock manure. Maybe you say livestock. No, I don't remember what the other word was, but manure is okay, I think. Christian Gartner, he preferred horse manure. Alternatively, manure from cows, sheep, or pigs can be used. And a new trench is dug next to the first, and the soil from this is laid on the top of the manure in the first trench. In this way, the entire garden must be worked through. Can we see? And Mr. Gartner, he emphasizes that when cultivating the soil, one must learn how to determine the quality of soil by looking at the color, the smell, the consistency, and structure, which together provide a lot of information. Wise word, I think. So, Fredrik Christian Schubler is another source from Norway, but he lived in the 19th century. And Schubler was a botanist and a very important person for Norwegian horticulture. He published several books and was a manager in a botanical garden in Oslo for at least 20 years, late in the 19th century. And Schubler, he describes a slightly different way of double digging. The procedure for digging deep trenches is similar, but Schubler describes what we in Norwegian call aurvelting. It's a strange Norwegian word, and I have written it here on the screen, as you can see, together with regulering, because these two words I have found together in almost all the sources I have examined. So regulering is not a Norwegian word, and it is written in different ways in the different sources. I think maybe it is originally from Germany, but I'm not sure. Skal vi se. Yes, but about aurvelting, I cannot translate this word. But according to the encyclopedia, aurvelting is about working with the soil deeper than normal and loosen the subsoil. Anyway, Schubler, he describes how the subsoil is to be loosened to a depth of about 20 centimeters, and he claims that the subsoil has a great impact on the topsoil, and in many cases can make it more fertile if it has substances that the topsoil lacks. Whether the subsoil is of good quality, and that is a suitable mixture of clay, sand, and organic materials, not too firm and not too loose. Then the subsoil can be dug up and laid on top of the topsoil in the previous trench. Mixing subsoil and topsoil is otherwise not recommended. Another source claims that one cannot expect a full crop the first 2 years after aurvelting. But then the results will show. This way of double digging garden soil was common throughout the 19th century and lasted until about 1950 in Norway. But the depth of the trenches has varied a lot. In a book from 1925, the recommended depth of the trenches is 30 to 40 centimeters. So it's a difference. And double digging of the soil should always take place in the fall season. Here all the sources are aligned. Frost and air will work with the top layer of the soil through the winter. And it's a wise way to take advantage of the seasonal variations. Yeah, here is Schübler's small test you can do with a spade to determine if the topsoil is of good quality. And he says that when you are working with soil, with a good quality, it should form loose lumps. And these lumps could be easily crushed with a spade, and of course with a little energy. So it's a small test everyone can do. Ska vi se. Yes, compost of course. Compost and composting. And there is actually quite a lot of information to be found about composting in the cultivation site. Manure and waste were added to improve soil structure and fertility. This was common. I was very happy to find compost recipes, and I will share some of these with you here. So this is from a Danish source. Maybe it's strange that I use a Danish source, but it is not at all. It was a natural connection between Norway and Denmark. So it is, I don't know his first names, but Jensen, or maybe you say Jensen, from Denmark, and his Danish horticulture book from 1864. I found several recipes here, and this is really a mix. He says that, ska vi se. Yes, make the compost like a square with as vertical sides as possible, and collect all types of waste such as weeds, rubbish, dung, leaves, ash, sand, horn and bone shavings, manure from poultry and latrines, blood, and intestines from slaughtered animals. A real mix. And lay the compost in layers with marl, or preferable quicklime. And maybe I should say something about marl. If you can find it again, it was, yeah, there it is. Marl is a type of limestone. And in the past, marl was often used as a soil improver to supply the plants with calcium. I hope I say it right, calcium, say it in the Norwegian way. And I find this use of marl both to add in soil and in compost. Many places in these horticulture books. Very sure. No, I lost. Yes. If some elements in the compost have a strong fertilizing effect, you can put turf in some layers. And when the compost is finished, it has to be watered with manure water or fertilizer water several times during the summer. And the compost must also be kept clean of weeds, because the weeds set seeds, and the seeds are spread with the compost. This is important information. And the compost can be used in the kitchen garden after 1 year. If it is to be used in a manure bench, it must stand for 2 years and be turned 2 or 3 times. In addition, it must be driven through a soil sieve to be fine-grained enough. Here is another recipe, and it is from a Norwegian source. His name is Peter Nøvik, and he is also important source for us at VEA in our study. So he was a gardener, and also he wrote several books, and I have examined 2 of his horticulture books from the 1890s. So composted turf, and Mr. Nøvik, he says that you should find places with clayey soil and natural grass growth where there has been grazing land for a long time, and dig up pieces of the turf to a depth of a few centimeters, and lay the pieces layer by layer in a compost heap with the grass upside down, and leave for a while, and turn the compost a few times and water with fertilizer water. And this will be ready to use after 1 year. Yes, and this is the last one. And it's about compost for potted plants. And it's from the Danish horticulture book again. He says this about plant soil for potted plants. Yes, compost soil. You can make compost soil of weeds, leaves, pieces from turf, and different kinds of waste, both in solid and liquid form, and also add lime marl. I say it wrong. I think it's. I think you say not lime marl, but marl. I think that's the right word. And marl is added for faster dissolution or transformation. And this compost must be turned 3 or 4 times and will be ready for use after 2 years. And when used, the compost is mixed with beech sand and some coal waste. This will be excellent for most potted plants, he says. And I thought it was very interesting about this coal waste. So I found a little information about using coal waste and charcoal. So the same author, he says that carbon dust and pieces of coal mixed in the soil has a good effect on root growth and keeps the soil airy. And access to coal and coal dust is easiest to obtain by the coal miles. Or you can pick up wood waste from the garden, add layers of straw, and cover with wet grass and light a fire. And this is how the charring happens, he says. So then you get charcoal. And here's a picture from an old charcoal in Norway. It's from the 19th century. Can we see? And here is, charcoal is also mentioned by Schibler. And he talks about the usefulness of mixing charcoal into soil in general. And he says that charcoal is suitable for almost all plants and all soil, as long as the soil is not too wet. And coarsely crushed charcoal is mixed into the soil in this way. Half a barrel of crushed coal is suitable to 100 feet of soil. This is Schubler's words. And this will make the soil loose and receptive to heat. And it will absorb water and gases that are very useful for plant growth. And the plants get what they need as needed. Well, I think I have, maybe I talked very, very fast now, but have I used, I hope I have used my 20 minutes, because this was my contribution to this webinar. So thank you all.
No, you were spot on. We just started a little
spot
early.
on.
So
Good.
you're exactly right. Well done. Something I wanted just to raise, and again, it's a language problem, I think. When you mentioned coal first time, I thought, oh, surely not coal, because for us in English, coal means the coal that is mined, the not charcoal, which is burned. So
Okay.
coal, I know, is toxic. If you put coal ash on the soil, it's actually quite toxic to plants, I believe. Whereas charcoal, which is wood, burnt wood, is very, very different.
I see. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Just to clarify, we don't
Yes.
want everyone putting coal on their soil.
No. This and this is information is new for me. I thought it was interesting to find this about charcoal, but I see what you mean. It's a different. So
Yes.
Charcoal and coal is not the
And
same.
coal are two very different things.
Yes.
So coal is the mineral mined and burned in power stations and things.
Yes,
and
I see.
charcoal
I
is
see.
from wood.
Yes.
So that's good. Well, thank you so much for that. So if you could stop your screen sharing, and we'll get back to seeing everybody's faces. We've got lots of thanks coming up on the chat for you and some questions, but I think we'll save the questions in the Q&A box until after Maria has spoken. So Maria, are you ready to share your screen? Or I can't remember, perhaps Ernestine is going to drive it for you.
No, I think, yes. Here it comes.
Does it come? Yeah. Is it?
That's one. That's the one.
Good.
You need to back up a bit.
Yep.
Ingeborg, you have it, I see.
I have it.
Excellent.
There it is.
So let me just say a few words about Maria. I'm sure she could say it for herself, but she's from Sweden and is a garden antiquarian, a researcher on garden history, and author of a book, 1,000 Years in the Garden. This is another book she's also done later on using, I beg your pardon, historical gardens preserving a changing cultural heritage. So she's got an honorary doctorate at the University of Gothenburg, and her talk, she's going to use historic garden manuals and household books and economic dictionaries from the years 1650 to 1980 to look into how composting was managed, and linked up with Karin's talk, where were the compost heaps in people's gardens and what did people put on them at different times. Looking forward very much to this talk, Maria.
Thank you. And Ingeborg, kan du backa bilderna?
Sure.
Där, just det. Thank you. last year I was asked to write a history of garden composts, and there had been questions from gardeners in historic gardens what composts had looked like at different times and in different environments, where they used to be placed, what they contained, and how they were managed. And I've used printed sources from the 1650 to 1980, garden manuals, household manuals, and economic dictionaries. Everything described in manuals does not have to be real. So I have relied on archaeological, garden archaeology for comparison, as Karin Lindgren has already told us today. The word compost is found in several Western European languages and has its origin in the Latin compositus, which means compound, mixed or blended. The oldest evidence in Swedish I have found is from 1731. Johan Kammaker had been on a 4-year study trip in England before he wrote his garden manual. En till sitt kära fäderneslands tjänst och nytta utgiven trädgårdsman. Kammaker uses the word compost, but in the English spelling, and he translates it as mixture. Next picture.
Oh, it's hung up. Sorry. Oh, here we are.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
No. Okay. The starting point for authors of garden manuals during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries have been larger manor houses in the country. There would have been plenty of space, preferably between the manure pile and the kitchen garden, for piles of different compost materials. On the estates, nature would be varied with lakes, streams, sandpits, bogs, meadows and forests, where the gardener could collect materials for his different cultures. In practice, there was always competition between the agricultural fields and the garden for manure, which meant that the gardener had to make the manure last longer by adding leftovers from other activities. Bark and sawdust from the sawmill, bones, horse and blood from the slaughter, ash from fireplaces, etc. This list is from Kammaker's book, and as you can see, he recommends both natural materials like sea sand and mud, and also human leavings as ash from the fireplaces, and fur and leather and cloths.
Next.
Another option than piles was to bury the manure, the compost in a pit. Their manure, ash, leaves, rotten wood, weeds, and other things were mixed with soil, and dirty water was led to the pit so it would not dry out. In the 17th century books, there is talk of animal manure, which needed to be 2 to 3 years old before it was used. So the gardeners must have observed decaying processes. The writers make no difference between kinds of decay. Everything that was broken down was said to rot. The manure recommended was cow, sheep, and chicken. That was the best to fertilize a garden with. But deep digging of the beds, so that mixing new soil with old was considered quite as good as fertilizing. And in this picture, you can see 2 women spreading good topsoil in a bed. They could quite easily have been spreading manure as well. During these times, mostly men were hired on year contracts, but women were hired to do extra work, and usually the dirtiest and the heaviest. Kammaker also recommended that a garden owner ought to take care of all dead cattle and collect them in a grave and cover with soil. Not yet, Ingeborg, not yet, until they had rotted. And rotted animals then became the best manure of all. A simpler alternative was to bury a dead cat or dog among the roots of a fruit tree to fertilize it. When it came to human excrement as manure, all the authors of garden books agreed that it was the most nutritious animal manure. Kammaker gave it a religious explanation. Because man was the highest of God's creations, human excrement was also the noblest of things. Were hesitant to use God of disgust. Now you can change the picture. A recommended solution was to mix the excrement with swept up debris from the floors in the houses, such as sand, spruce twigs, leaves, and dust. Several authors also suggesting placing a pile of soil or leaves or peat and sand and other dry garbage from the garden next to the latrine. Every evening, this material would be shoveled over to cover it with. In this way, the smell was avoided and the dung was fermented together with a dry material. After a week, the manure was moved to a pile and mixed again with other materials. At this time, everyone had a chamber pot under their beds to pee in during the night. These pots were collected in the morning by a maid and the contents poured on the manure pile or the compost heap. Urine mixed in a barrel with washing and dishwater could be a good liquid fertilizer. And here we see a woman mixing this liquid fertilizer. Again, the dirtiest and heaviest work. In the 18th century farmers' gardens, most of the manure was used primarily for the vegetable plots, while the fields received much less or none at all. In the 19th century, the fields were given more priority. Manure piles were collected there, but seldom compost heaps. For owners of really small farms, it was always possible to have at least a pig or some chickens that could provide manure apart from the latrine. The people ate everything there was to eat. The small amount of waste from the kitchen and the garden was given as feed to chickens and pigs. There was no organic waste to compost. If there was anything at all, it was put in the manure pile. Western Europe's colonization of other continents and improved communications made plant nutrition a commodity in world trade. From the 1820s, trade in bone meal increased. It was produced both in local stamp mills and in larger factories. From the 1840s, guano was imported to Europe to be used as fertilizer. In the middle of the 19th century, factories were set up around the cities to convert human and animal manure, fish, ash, and offal into artificial fertilizers that were sold to farmers and market gardens. At the same time, chemistry was developed and a new science was used in agriculture. I'm sorry. And a new science was used in agriculture to find inorganic resources for the production of nitrogen fertilizers. authors of garden books knew about artificial fertilizers, which they considered might be used in case of lack of natural manure. During the 19th century, more citizens acquired villa gardens. These contained advanced cultivation managed by gardeners, but the residential plots were considerably smaller than a country estate. The gardeners wanted an equally effective composting, but in a smaller space. So they laid a mixed pile instead of several piles. The small area may also be the reason why the compost heap was recommended to be placed out of sight and of smelling range from the ornamental garden. Karin's picture showing the compost bins at the end of the garden was for inner city gardens, which was very small, and the villa gardens were placed at the outskirt of the gardens, where there was more room.
Are we still on the right picture, Maria?
Yeah.
Yep. Are we still on the right picture? I shouldn't move.
Yeah, you can switch now.
Yep.
And with this one and only compost heap, the different materials were alternated in layers. The size and shape, round or oblong, varied, but they should not be laid too high. A maximum of 2 meters was recommended in the books, and the width from between 1.5 to 3 meters. The length depended on how much material was available and also the space. A depression in the middle was recommended so that rainwater or liquid manure would sink into the compost and not run off. The compost heap should be turned over at least twice a year. Some writers recommended every month. The turned heap could be covered with soil, and to look neater, it could be sown with cucumbers, pumpkins, spinach, New Zealand spinach, or nasturtium in different colors. And then next picture. All dirty water from the kitchen, from washing and cleaning as well as urine, was mixed in barrels and used to water both plants and composts. It was used especially for plants that needed extra nitrogen, such as tomatoes, cucumbers, cabbages, lettuce, and spinach, as well as lawns. Shortcut lawns were a novelty around 1900 in villa gardens and city parks. And in this picture, we see a woman who is pouring out liquid manure. And in this book from the 1910s, it was recommended that you would dig a small channel or small holes and then pour in the liquid manure, and after that cover it up again with the soil. This way it would neither smell nor it would evaporate. During the 19th century, it was noticed that compost increased humus content in the soil. In the early 20th century, the usefulness of compost as a fertilizer was questioned after chemical analysis had showed that compost only contained small amounts of nutrients. The compost was redefined as a soil improver. Everyone could observe that humus improved soil, and humus was considered necessary for a good cultivation result, even if the cause was not yet clear. From around 1900, garden newspapers had advertisements for various types of commercial fertilizers. It could say, "Do not let your plants starve," and other equally and other such I forgot the word. All right, I continue. The authors of garden manuals were still critical and emphasized that artificial fertilizers were only a complement. Cattle manure and compost were still needed to maintain the humus content of the topsoil, and without humus, the soil would be depleted. Other substances were introduced as alternatives. Peat was considered the cheapest and best soil improver during the 20th century. Bark mold began to be used in the 1960s. They even tried plastic, like plastic foam or styrofoam. The next picture, please. It was known in the early 20th century that bacteria and various microorganisms played an important role in the decomposition of compost. Research has shown that microlife in the compost is what improves the topsoil and makes the nutrients available to plants. The first book about garden compost in Swedish came in 1979, and this picture was illustrating it, or as perhaps more as a cartoon made by Veltman, and its title was Livat I komposten, which can mean lively in the compost or perhaps living it up in the compost. And it was at this time people began talking about the living earth, and it was not considered as an exaggeration. When the compost began to be appreciated again, it could be given pride of place in the garden. It need not be hidden away. Some seem to have become more enchanted with the compost itself and the soil than by the plants that could be grown in it. And today's options are many on a scale between the extremes of those who concentrate on the compost and try to be self-sufficient, and those who cover the existing soil with plastic and then place pallet collars and buy already mixed soil in plastic bags. This article, I have not quite finished it yet, but as for advice on composting in historic gardens, I think it would be of great interest to gardens visitors today to be able to show how to take care of leftovers and rubbish through reuse, repair, reworking, and composting. Some methods from the past are already in practical use. For example, multoa. I'm not sure how to translate that. It could be soil toilets. You poo in one end, and then it comes after a month or two. It comes out as very nice.
Composting toilets. Composting toilets.
Composting toilets. Thank you.
Yeah.
Also using urine as a liquid fertilizer. It's in all the garden papers today. And the use of biochar. As Marit just said, it has been used before, mostly in agriculture. But the farmers could herd their animals to a place where they had been making charcoal, but the coal was already taken away. But leave the animals overnight on top of the remaining char. And then when they had fertilized it, they would dig it up and take it out to the fields. When choosing methods and forms for compost in historic gardens, the gardener must take into account the type of garden in question and the time period to be shown. If it is a manor house from the 18th century, several piles with different materials can be laid up to show the handling of compost and manure at that time. But there was a question about could it be put in the kitchen garden, and that was not recommended. And that was because people thought that the compost would grow of itself worms and other vermin that could eat the garden plants. So the compost should be kept outside of the kitchen garden until it was already broken down to a nice structure. If it is a farm hamlet from the 19th century, the lack of compost must be a part of the story of life in that hamlet. And there will be more. This is a very short summary of the article, and it will be published together with an article of Katarina Sjöberg, which is the next speaker, by the University of Gothenburg, together in a little book about composting, and it will be come out early 2023, I think, in Swedish. But if there is a great demand of translation, maybe it can be fixed.
Well, thank you very much. That was really fascinating, Maria. And it's so interesting. I've never really thought that, of course, you can only compost what is waste material. And if you don't have any waste, what do you compost?
No.
It's really interesting.
That has actually been true in small holdings. Mm-hmm. Up until they were up until the 1950s and 60s, because I know those whose parents had these small holdings, and they can describe this, that there was no waste, and they were very angry when the municipalities wanted them to pay to have their waste collected.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Well, I think that's a theme that's going to recur throughout the day is what is waste, and actually that whole circular philosophy of putting everything back into the soil. And we buy a lot of stuff in. One of those things, as you talked about, Maria, is peat, and that is a very hot topic at the moment in the UK. And so we're going to be asking a little bit about peat policy in people's gardens over lunch break. But we have one more speaker, Katarina. Now, how do I pronounce your surname, Katarina? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Sjöberg.
Oh, I'm going to leave that to you. All right. So I think we're going to be, are you sharing your screen, or Anna-Steen possibly, or Ingeborg is going to be showing? We had a few technical problems with Zoom and PowerPoints, and there's all sorts of conspiracy theories as to why this might be, or it might just be that we're not used to the technology. Well, probably, I don't know which to go with. But Katarina is a senior lecturer in garden crafts. What a lovely title for a job, at the University of Gothenburg in the Department of Cultural Conservation. And she's currently working on a project through the Craft Laboratory on compost and soil improvement in historic gardens. And she's going to tell us all about how she and her students are actually testing homemade, well, we should call it growing media, I think, to distinguish between compost that you spread on the ground and compost that you put in pots and grow things in. And she's going to be sharing that with us. So hopefully this slide show will work from the beginning. At the moment, I'm seeing the whole thing.
Okay.
So we need to see the first slide, if that's okay.
Let me see, what's that?
Is it Anna-Steen or Ingeborg is showing it?
I am trying to show it.
Oh, you're showing it.
Yes.
Okay. So
and it doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, this is what happened in the rehearsal, didn't it?
Yes. So I'll just stop sharing.
Yeah.
And see if you can find it.
So Anna-Steen, do you have it? Yes, good. So this is the fallback position. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you. Nice to be here. And I am going to speak about one of the things that you can use that compost for. The last 4 years, I have worked with different aspects of soil, such as composting in the context of the historical garden, together with Maria Flink. And also before that, in another project with the craft lab about making growing media for plant production in pots. And that's what I'm going to speak about today. And basically this started 4 years ago and was a quite small project on making growing media, where we created 2 mixes, 2 different growing media recipes from scratch, made from our own composts and local materials. And then we cultivated plants for planting out in these 2 mixes, and we evaluated the results afterwards and compared it to plants growing in a commercial mix. And then since then, we have also continued doing this together with the students within the courses of the program. And next picture. We can change the picture. Thank you. Well, the inspiration for these mixes came from a notebook that a colleague of mine, Inger Olausson, gave to me. It was written, oh, actually, there's one picture. You can back one picture. It looks a bit strange. The screen looks a bit strange on my computer. Now it works. So this notebook was written by a gardener in 1912, and the notebook was full of different recipes for growing media for growing plants. And I will come back to that notebook in a little moment, but first I would like to just give a small picture of, or background picture to growing media in Sweden, and perhaps there are similarities in other countries as well. When I was reading Nils Welander's notebook, it led me to reflect around the differences between his experiences and skills as a gardener, 1912, compared to today. And I realized to what an extent this was a field of knowledge held by the gardener in 1912. In comparison to that, and looking at myself and my own experience, I had some theoretical knowledge about growing media and the ingredients, what kind of characteristics they had. But despite growing plants for planting out every spring during my whole working life, I had never mixed growing media from scratch. And I know that I share this experience with many other gardeners in Sweden. And the reason for that is, of course, the readily available and cheap commercial products that are usually of good quality. So from an individual gardener's perspective, this can be seen as a sort of traditional lost skill. There's also, of course, a connection to sustainability. Making your own growing media can, for example, give you the possibility to avoid transports and packaging, and you can use local material. From a more local perspective, this project also addressed pedagogical questions that we work with in the bachelor program, specifically about that part of a gardener's knowledge that you cannot learn by reading, but that have to be experienced and done to learn. And making growing media seemed like a good thing to let students work with, to get close to their material. And finally, this project also made it possible for us to build up an infrastructure for making different composts to use as ingredients in this growing media. And now we can change the picture. So this is the picture of this notebook. The name of the gardener was Nils Welander, and he was working as a gardener his whole life. The book is dated 1912, and in it he describes 29 different plant cultures, mostly it was decorative plants like zinnia, geraniums, hortensias, but also cabbage plants, strawberries, and cuttings of wine. He describes temperatures for times for sowing and transplanting, and every culture has its specific soil mix. One for sowing or cuttings, and then another mix for transplanting. And sometimes he's transplanting 2 or 3 times, each time with a different soil mix. So altogether, there are around 80 individual soil mixes for sowing, cuttings, and transplanting in this notebook. He is using wooden boxes and clay pots, and he also grows plants in hotbeds, bare-rooted plants in hotbeds. And the system of cultivation is an important difference between now and then. We didn't try to recreate the full cultivation system, but we used the boxes, the pots that we normally use in our garden, in the greenhouse. And now we can change the picture. I want to give just one example of what a page in this book may look like. And that example is Latyrus, which he sows in pure fine sand, and then he transplants them into pots, 6 plants in each, and he uses soil from the hotbed, sand, compost, and peat. He sometimes plants them in boxes, in soil from the ground where he's working, soil from the hotbed, and cow manure. And he also uses some commercial products for fertilizing products. You can change the picture. There are 9 ingredients that are used in all the recipes in varying proportions, and it's leaf mold, sand, soil from the ground from 2 different varieties that I don't really know the difference between them, soil from hotbeds and manure from hotbeds, peat, cow manure, and compost. The leaf mold seems to be a very important ingredient in his mixes. And it's likely that he composted the leaf mold himself, and perhaps also the other compost that he was using. But there are many questions around these ingredients. How did he treat the compost? What does the compost consist of? Is it a mix of household waste and garden waste? And all these things will, of course, influence the characteristics of the composts. There's also questions around the manure and many of the other ingredients. So it's easy to understand that with so many uncomparable parameters, we didn't reconstruct a recipe or a process, but we took inspiration in this experiment from the old recipes and the way of working of the gardener. Next picture, please. Thank you. So we designed 2 different soil mixes that were inspired by the notebook. And we evaluated them in our modern system for growing plants in square plastic pots. And the first mix was based on Velander's recipes for transplanting of calceolaria. It consisted of soil from the garden, which was loam, leaf mold, garden waste, compost, and cow manure. And we can change picture. And the second mix, in the second mix, we wanted to use the way of thinking and working as an inspiration. And we used sustainability as being an important question today. Therefore, we choose to do a mix of only organic origin with renewable and local ingredients, leaf mold, cow manure, and composted bark. Next picture, please. And the third mix was, as I said, this commercial product that is peat-based, and it's a product that we normally use in the garden. Well, this picture is just to show a little bit of the different structures of these ingredients. Next picture, please. And this is the working table where we evaluated the transplanting procedure of these mixes. You can see the small scale of this project and also the pots that we were using for transplanting. It took some time to get used to the different characteristics of the mixes. They were very different from the peat mix that we were used to. Next picture, please. And this picture shows the plant development a few days before planting out. And it's all the plants in the different mixes developed well, and it wasn't just until before planting out here at this moment where you could actually see a clear difference between the development. So the plants in the commercial product grew a little bit better, but all of them were good enough, were of good enough quality. Next picture, please. So the parameters that we compared were weeds, and as we expected, there were no weeds in the commercial product and quite a lot of weeds in the products that were based on garden compost and soil. But it didn't become a problem because we grew very quick and short cultures, cabbage and lettuce. So the weeds died when we planted out the plants. We looked at root development, and all roots developed well. There was some waterlogging in the mixes that we made ourselves. So the roots in those pots were thinner, a bit like the roots that you get when you put a cutting in water, these thin roots. And we looked at the root. See, I can see the picture. The root clump, how it held together when we took it out of the pot. Next picture, please. Yes, the watering as well was slightly different with the homemade mixes holding water much better, which made it a bit difficult to water. It was easy to water too much. And we looked at the planting out situation as well and compared. Next picture, please. And the weight was the last parameter that we compared, where the commercial mix was much lighter than the other mixes, which may be important for when you're working with it if you produce a lot of plants. Next picture, please. The analysis of the different soils showed that mix number 1 and 2 were low in nitric, nitrogen, calcium, and sulfur compared to mix 3, but very high in potassium. So they were very unbalanced regarding many of the substances. Next picture, please. So, and when you look at the optimal proportions between the 3 major substances, you can see as well that there is a big unbalance on the homemade mixes, and despite that, they produced reasonably good-looking plants. And I think that's one of the practical lessons from this experiment, that it is very possible to grow decent plants in a homemade mix. Next picture, please. It's important to mention here, I think, that making growing media, if it's in a historical garden or in a more modern context, is also a question of resources and visions. A big part of this mixing growing media, if you want to do it from scratch, is working with the different composts, the different ingredients. And this is satisfying work, but it does take time and dedication and quite hard work to make good quality compost. But then if you do have the resources and the possibility for this, I think that in making your own growing media from scratch, history and sustainability meet in a way that contributes to stimulating discussions, and it inspires people. My experience is that soil inspires feelings of meaningfulness in many people. And in my teaching, I find that as a craft practice, making growing media has been a meaningful exercise for the students that gives them the opportunity to get very close to one of their most elemental materials. It's this body knowledge or situation knowledge. And we have continued to experiment with these growing media or growing mixes with the students, and we keep finding that it usually works quite well. We have tried just to grow plants in just pure composted bark watered with fertilizer, and that worked fine. And actually the only mix so far that hasn't worked out so well, it is a mix where we used biochar or char, and that the plants in that mix didn't grow at all well, actually. But I think we're going to work with that and try again. It's interesting actually to know here as well that the smell of soil stimulates the release of oxytocin in humans, which is this substance that promotes feelings of trust and care and connection. So soil does that. Soil has an influence on us that is psychological as well. Well, I think that's what I had to say. I would be really interested in hearing from other people's experience on this subject.
Oh,
thank you.
Wonderful, Katarina. Thank you. I'm so pleased you talked about the smell of the soil, because for me, that's something I miss now that I'm not digging, is the smell of the soil. You get it when you're mixing compost, so that's another reason for doing it, but it is such a wonderful smell. We talked about the bad smells of rotting manure or whatever it was, but there's a good smell when it all works right and you know things are going to grow well in it. Fantastic, thank you.
Definitely.
So we're going to have, we're perfect for time. I can't believe how good you're all being. We're going to have some questions, but I think we've got a little poll, again, questioning our participants, because it might help with the panel discussion that we're going to have before lunch. So Ernestine, could you put the poll up and we'll just see if we can get people to answer some questions. Right, here we go. So hopefully everyone can see this on their screen and they can answer and we'll get some idea. So I think we could probably, Ernestine, shall we start on the questions while people do the poll as well? Because there's quite a few, and we did say we were going to stop at 12:15, which is in 15 minutes in GMT. So now going right back, we have a question about measurements, because this came up in Marit's talk about those different measurements, and Hannah wants to know if there's a website or a book to translate the old measurements. So I think, Maria, did you have a look at that problem?
I think you can find it in Wikipedia.
Ah, really? Fantastic.
At least there is one on Swedish with Wikipedia, but that's for the Swedish measurements. And I know that it's not the same in all countries, and it's not the same over time.
Right, of course.
So no, it's a bit tricky.
And Marit,
sometimes they were measuring themselves.
Yes.
And then a foot could be between number 36 to a number 46.
Right. Okay. So, and then there was a question from Marit about digging. Did you find any evidence of historical recommendations that digging should be done at different times of the year according to the type of soil that you have? I heard that sandy soils would be better to dig in the spring, whereas heavy soil benefits from digging just before the winter. But I wonder if that's a modern idea.
I don't know if I can answer very short on that question, because obviously you don't get the same effect on sandy soil or soil with a predominance of sand. And during the winter, you don't need it in the same way as you have to on the clay soil. But you know, it's a lot of information in these books about different types of soil and how to add compost and manure to improve these different kind of soil. So, but when they are writing about double digging or this working in the depth of the soil, they all are agreed of that this is a work for the fall.
Yeah, for the autumn.
But of course, it is a difference between sandy soil and clay soil. So it is not easy to answer in a few words, I think.
Yeah. And quite often rules that we hear about with horticulture are simply that is the time that you have to do it.
Yes.
The time is available, therefore you dig in the autumn because you're not sowing your seeds or whatever. It's nothing horticultural, but you have the time.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so let's see what other. Oh yes, we had this question from Jennifer Bamba to Marit, and can you clarify it's charcoal produced from wood or fossil coal? And we actually had a little debate in the questions, Joachim saying that he was very pleased to see when we clarified that it was from wood, that charcoal has been used historically, and that the contemporary practice of biochar that we're going to talk about this afternoon was an interesting way of linking authenticity and sustainability to historic gardens. So it just proves yet again that there's nothing very new in gardening. So there's a question here for Maria. Were there any thoughts that there would be loss of nitrogen if you used fresh or concentrated manure and urine in the past?
No, they never mention it. But what they do is they all talk about not using too fresh manure or human excrement or urine, because that would hurt the plants. So they would have to be standing and maturing before they could be used.
So they knew about plants being scorched by strong manure, but they didn't know necessarily of the effect on the soil of nitrogen.
No, and the scorching would be visible almost immediately.
Yes, of course.
If you use it. No, I don't think they thought it would lose in nitrogen from waiting to use it. But rather, I think they thought it would concentrate because it would get better and better.
Now, here's a question that is for any of you really, from Jan. When building gardens today, we usually have to bring in quite a lot of soil, topsoil. Do you find this being done also in the 19th and the 18th century in gardens in the city and for manor houses? Have you come across that at all? People actually bringing in soil?
Yes, sometimes. And that was, I think Karin might have an example from an archaeological site where the topsoil had been moved in from another place. And there is also Norwegian research about lighthouses, the gardens at lighthouses or far out on the coast, where the topsoil was so valuable that they would collect it every autumn and transport it further inland so it wouldn't be swept away during the winter.
Oh,
and then they would bring it back in the spring.
Oh, wow, that's a lot of work.
But usually when it comes to a manor house, it's what do you have to do to make the soil at that place useful?
Exactly, improve what you have. Yeah. Karin, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, we have seen that at many places, at many excavations, that there has been brought soil just to level the ground, not for growing, and then put topsoil on that. It's almost always like that you bring the soil to the place.
Yeah. Okay. I've just seen question in the chat about the poll is not coming up. I haven't seen it either in the chat. So, Anastine, perhaps we should put it up again, if possible. But in the meantime, let's come. We've got lots of questions here. So this is for Katarina, I think. Joe Miles is asking a bit more information about Wilander. Where was he gardening? Presumably as a professional gardener. Do you think the recipes are all his own, or are they any contemporaneous printed sources that look like a source of inspiration?
Yes. Well, Nils Wilander, he was gardening in the Stockholm area, and he was a renowned gardener. He got some prizes for some of the plants that he produced. And you can read some more about him. My colleague Inger Olausson has written a dissertation on nursery gardeners in the Stockholm area, and Nils Wilander is one of them. And maybe I can send a link to her.
Good. Yes. Well, as I said at the beginning, we're going to have a list of sources and documents that people can access. So anything like that, it would be great if you could send. And yeah. Joe also had another question about waterlogging, that possibly it might be interesting to compare your experience with plastic pots with what Wilander would have experienced with porous wooden seed trays and terracotta pots, because they do dry out a lot quicker, in my experience, certainly.
Yes, that would be really interesting. Yeah, I've thought about that many times, and I think it would be the mixes would probably work much better in that kind of other pots.
Yeah,
definitely. And there was also the question about whether these recipes, whether I think these recipes were Nils Wilander's own recipes, or if he got his inspiration from somewhere. And it's difficult to say if he's making up those recipes as he goes. But I think one thing that indicates that is that he's writing dates, exact dates, that this is transplanted the 21st of March, for example. That might indicate that he's making it up as he, he's making this mix and he's writing it down and he's evaluating it afterwards. But I imagine, since he is a very experienced gardener, I imagine that he is also getting his inspiration from somewhere. He was he was abroad. I think it was in Germany, working in Germany as well for a few years during his career. So I don't know, maybe, but I think he got his inspiration from
another fine example of learning from different gardeners in different countries, which is exactly what we're doing today. Great.
Yeah. Yes.
Now here's a question for you again, Katarina, and I'm afraid I don't understand this, I have to say. Did you utilize millisiemens for calculating how well the soil parts with nutrients? Does that mean anything to you? To me.
No, we didn't. We sent the soil to an analysis company to find out only the nutrition levels and the pH and this. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then another question about leaf mold. When you're making leaf mold, should you separate out trees where there are infestations of insects, or can you use those leaves in your compost making?
I suppose it might depend on exactly what pest that you have, but normally if you're going to use the leaf mold for sowing and this kind of things, it's the pests that are on the leaves are not pests that will attack your plants. It's pests that attack the trees. So normally it will be okay, I would say, to use leaf mold with little worms on them.
Okay. And now here's a comment really about biochar, because it sounds like you didn't have a great deal of success with growing in biochar, but it has to be enriched before use. For example, with chicken manure, and then it works well, apparently, according to Haldis. Now, there's a question from, we're running quite short of time, Francisca. I missed if you were using soil in the Velander mix, and if you did you test the soil in advance? So in other words, that component would have had its own nutrients, wouldn't it?
Yes, definitely. There is a soil analysis on the soil that we used. Yes, and well, it's a loam soil, and I don't know what soil Nils Welander was using. I think it was loam, but I'm not sure. But yes, that will make a big difference, of course.
Of course it will. And somebody wants to know whether you actually used your own substrate or growing media for sowing seeds in the first place, or was it just for pricking out?
It was just for pricking out or transplanting. Yes, we used commercial products for sowing.
It's getting it fine enough is always the issue, isn't it? But then there are sieves and things that you can use, but it's an awful lot of work.
Yeah.
So we've still got more and more questions coming in. Let me have a look. Did people use mulches or the no-dig technique before the 20th century, or is this a relatively modern idea? So this might be a question for Charles this afternoon, actually. He might know the answer. Does anybody else, have you come across this idea of not digging and just piling on mulch after mulch? Nobody's answering yet, so I suspect.
I haven't come across the no digging, but mulching I have seen in 1860, 80 and later in a couple of places, like covering the soil, but not the no dig.
Right, okay. Well, let's ask Charles about that this afternoon. And Nora wants to know about whether there was an awareness of spreading disease when using human manure. Did that come up at all? So Maria, you might have come across that.
Not in the early literature, but when we come to the 20th century, that is mentioned, and it is not recommended because of stomach diseases and such things.
So there was some awareness then.
Otherwise, they seem to think that if it was only, it was left to in the composting process for at least a year, and sometimes up to 3 years. And I don't know about these parasites, how long time it takes for them to die off.
So last question I think we have time for is about beach sand. Somebody was concerned that, of course, that contained salt. Wasn't that dangerous for plants?
It would have been inland lakes, also sweetwater lakes.
So sand from, okay.
And both Sweden and Norway have a lot of sweet water. So
right, okay, so fresh water we would call that. Yes, okay.